Well, it was way back in 1979 when the revolution happened in Iran. The Shah was overthrown. And ever since that moment in time, Iran has been led by a really extreme Islamist ideology. It has become a country that treats its own people incredibly brutally. It has become a country that we know has funded its terrorist proxies all around the region. And last night, for the first time, it launched up to 350 missiles against the state of Israel. I think some good has come out of this. It's now pretty clear to everybody who the real bad guys are. It also shows militarily that Israel, with its allies, and in particular the Americans, and indeed the British Royal Air Force, were able to intercept and shoot down nearly all of the missiles. But in terms of what Israel should do next, and in terms of how this might play out with the Iranian public, and that is the thing that particularly interests me, I'm very, very pleased to be joined down the line from Washington, D.C. by Reza Pahlavi, the Crown Prince of Iran. Welcome to the program. Thank you. Do you kind of get my point that if this was a really big push by Iran to cause maximum damage in Israel, it did actually fail, didn't it?
Well, yes, and that's part of what the regime needed to do to prove to its base at home that they're doing something about the elements of the Revolutionary Guards that were taken out recently. So basically, it's their way of responding to that, mostly for domestic consumption, and prove that they've done something. But it's been entirely embarrassing, I would say, for a country that once had one of the most powerful non-nuclear armies to have so many billions of dollars wasted on this kind of arsenal, and as a result, not even have an effective means of doing anything. And Iranians who are, in the meantime, suffering at home, Iranian women who are simultaneously brutalized in Iran, people queuing up for gasoline and food, our currency being devalued at 10,000 times the value that it had before the revolution, in their economic situation, are wondering, why is all our country's resources wasted by this regime? The answer is simple. The regime never cared about the Iranian people. It only cares about exporting this ideology. And this is why it has, for the past 4 decades, been a menace to the region and the rest of the world.
I was in the last hour having some quite passionate arguments, one with the former British ambassador to Iran, who was a very strong supporter of the JCPOA agreement, and my own view and others, which is that, frankly, from Obama, with Biden by his side, to the European Union, who appear to be almost unrepentant today, that we have literally appeased Iran. What is your conclusion to this? Was it the deal that Obama put forward with EU support and indeed British support? Was it that freed up the money for Iran to fund its proxies?
Well, clearly, for this regime to have had more access to funds that they would not have really obtained had, for instance, the oil sanction being fully implemented, the regime has had at least an extra $100 billion worth of revenue that, of course, it spent on its proxy wars. It is not therefore a coincidence. We see what the Houthis are doing, what Hamas did, and God knows what else will be done down the line. When you, in fact, as a result of appeasement, incentivize the regime and empower them to do more, we shouldn't be surprised that it will have such adverse consequences. But I think we need to really think ultimately, what is the solution to the problem? I think the biggest weakness, and I've been arguing this for a long time now, that the biggest flaw in terms of the foreign policy of Western governments vis-a-vis this regime has been an expectation of behavior change. And this has been, from the very beginning, the wrong approach. Why? Because if you don't understand the DNA of this regime, if you don't understand that their values are completely the opposite of the free world in terms of human rights and democracy and liberty, that their sole objective is to impose regionally and beyond a modern-day Shiite caliphate, which is why it justifies every steps that they have taken. That's what we are facing at the end of the day. And the only solution, ultimately, to the problem is for this regime to be no longer in place.
I'll be better than I was.
Yes, and that would need a counter-revolution. And every few years or so, we do see street protests in Iran, in Tehran and other parts of Iran, and we see an upwelling of people protesting against the brutalization of society, protesting against the way women are treated, protesting about the sheer levels of poverty that they're living in. But it's very difficult for us to assess what the level of discontent within Iran with the regime actually is. Is there any accurate measure that we've got on that?
Well, I think you can have much more ample evidence of where people are and how they think if there's a better usage of information available on social media. Iranians have been very active in trying to send as many messages to the entire world to prove to the world exactly where they stand. We can hear it in their demonstrations. We can hear it in what they post out there. We have citizen reporters every day talking about the malaise in Iran and the fact of how much disenchantment there is against the regime. But there's also an expectation from the outside world. Look, let's not reinvent the wheel. Most movements that ultimately led to the liberation of countries in recent history, look at the Solidarity movement in Poland, look at what happened in South Africa, and many similar examples. It could not have happened without the tacit support of the outside world. If we want to avoid confrontation, and if it's going to be done at the hands of the people of that country, in this case Iran, then the only solution is empowerment. You have to give them a fair chance to succeed. If they are completely helpless and abandoned under a very brutal regime, they cannot sustain this all by themselves forever. We need to be able at some point to have much more tacit support for the world. And the way that can happen is two things. One is to have a policy of increasing more pressure on the regime by means of sanctions. Perhaps it is time for the European countries to put the IRGC on the list of terrorist organization, which will bring more pressure on the regime. And parallel to that, have a policy of maximum support. In what way can they actually help the Iranian people have more means to be able to fight the fight at home? The combination of the external and domestic pressure should be enough to bring the regime down to its knees. But this is also not just a matter of regime change. We need to be able to have a peaceful transition to a future democracy. And that's where we need to all be very coordinated, Iranians among themselves and the free world, if indeed they believe that that's a much better course of action to put an end to this regime, meaning all the problems that the world has been facing, and instead have a country that is now an element contributing to regional peace, stability, and cooperation.
Well, Crown Prince Reza, I personally would love to see that. I think most of us who love freedom and democracy and peace would love to see that as well. And thank you very much indeed for joining me tonight here
Thanks
on
for
GB
having
News.
me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, isn't it? You know, clearly, there are a lot of people living in Iran, highly dissatisfied with living under this extremist regime, and yet every time they try and protest, of course, they are brutally put down.